The title of the meeting today is Hegelian Contradiction and the Prime Numbers, which I believe is going to be the first part of a two-part series, the second part being sometime early in the new year. So, Ian, do you want to proceed?
Thanks, Ed. Okay, so let's start. So Marx called Hegel a mighty thinker and was thoroughly influenced by him. And many of the concepts of Marx's Capital can be traced back to Hegel's Science of Logic, published in 1812. But Hegel's logic is extremely abstract and obscure. Philosophy can be difficult, but Hegel is especially difficult. He twists you up, down, left and right, and the effect is really quite dizzying. So the difficulty of understanding Hegel partly explains the never-ending tension within Marxism between those who think Hegel is absolutely necessary to the tradition and those who think he's something of a liability. So in this introductory talk, I want to raise the following questions, which is, what is Hegel's logic, or at least the beginnings of it, and is it a logic worth having? And any logic worth having should be able to tell us something new about the world. And Marxists may well point to Marx's historical materialism as evidence of the efficacy of Hegel's logic. But Hegel intended his logic to be universal and apply to all phenomena. So I want to put Marx to one side and instead test whether Hegel's logic has anything new to say about fundamental reality, in particular some aspects of physics and number theory. So today, we'll just look at chapter 1 of Hegel's Science of Logic, and the main argument you'll find on one side of the handout. And in the second part, which Zed mentioned I will give next year, we'll see how Hegel's logic applies to analytic number theory, in particular the Riemann zeta function and the nature of the primes. So we've got quite a lot of material to get through, so let's begin with just a few remarks about what Hegel is trying to achieve in the Science of Logic. So he aims to discover the fundamental structure of everything from pure reflection alone. And if you're a hard-nosed materialist, you might already begin to start worrying. But if you are a materialist, then you believe we're constructed from the same stuff as everything else in the universe. And so it follows that our cognition must share some fundamental properties with everything. So pure reflection from that point of view might give us immediate access to some kind of knowledge about those fundamental properties. So materialism doesn't really preclude Hegel's project here. He claims to begin his Science of Logic with zero assumptions. He wants to take philosophical doubt even further than Descartes. So Hegel's beginning even rejects the I, and the I think, therefore I am. And those familiar with modern formal logic might also be starting to worry, because we can't really deduce anything without axioms and inference rules. So this starting point doesn't seem to make much sense. But Hegel isn't really in the business of deduction here. His approach is more like an empirical investigation where the raw data happens to be accessed via pure reflection. He aims to merely observe what is there once we drop all our knowledge, all our presuppositions, all our theories, and even the sense of our own existence. So Hegel's starting point is in a way mystical and psychedelic. And he actually does mention the ego-free state of someone who meditates while staring at the nose and chanting Om. He actually talks about that. So it's very mystical. And he hopes that if we start from pure reflection, we'll gain some knowledge of bedrock metaphysical properties which are absolutely necessary. So that's his project. So let's begin where Hegel does. We don't have to close our eyes and start chanting, but we do need to abstract from all possible thought contents and consider what remains. And Hegel says that what remains is pure being, or existence itself. He says this beginning must be abstract because we can't suppose anything. The beginning can't have any properties or content or distinctions. It must, according to Hegel, be purely and simply an immediacy, or rather merely immediacy itself. And according to Hegel, pure being is the unity into which knowing has collapsed into at the extreme point of its union with the object. So at the beginning, there isn't really a knowing subject contemplating its own existence. Instead, there's only pure being that in some obscure sense knows that it exists. I think it's worth emphasizing at this point that when Hegel talks about pure being, it's not really just an abstract concept. He's actually talking about a real phenomenon, an actually existing thing that he claims we all have immediate access to if we're prepared to perform this mental exercise. So pictures can help. So let me draw Hegel's self-referential starting point with a simple diagram. So we've got being. I'm just going to label it X for now. There it is. And then we have this. So this arrow in the diagram indicates the self-referential nature of Hegel's beginning. We could say this outward port here is pure being, and this inward port is pure knowing. So we have thought contemplating itself. And it doesn't seem to be a very promising start, because it's not obvious that anything follows from this entirely psychedelic insight. But then Hegel points out that pure being is so pure, it lacks any content at all. It's basically so abstract, it's empty, and therefore is nothing. It's nothing at all. And so we thought we had pure existence, but this kind of existence is nothing. It's a complete void. As Hegel says, pure being is just empty thinking. So we could equally draw the beginning as nothing. Lost a bit of blackness there. So this is the same picture, we just label it differently. Just label it nothing. But there is a difference, because being has a distinct connotation, which is existence, but nothing has a different connotation, which is absence. So it seems like we've got two things. When we consider pure being, the most abstract concept of all, we find that as soon as we have it, we're left with nothing at all. But pure nothing, of course, exists, because we've just observed it. So although it's pure nothing, it has the property of existing. So the concept of pure nothing seems to turn immediately back into pure being. We seem to swap back and forth between these two viewpoints of the very same abstract beginning. And at this point in his argument, Hegel suddenly says a number of very remarkable things. So I'm going to give you a quote from Hegel. Pure being and pure nothing are therefore the same. What is the truth is neither being nor nothing, but that being does not pass over, but has passed over into nothing, and nothing into being. But it is equally true that they are not undistinguished from each other, that, on the contrary, they are not the same. They are absolutely distinct. And yet, that they are unseparated and inseparable, and that each immediately vanishes into its opposite. Their truth is, therefore, this movement of the immediate vanishing of the one into the other, becoming, a movement in which both are distinguished, but by a difference which has equally, immediately resolved itself. And so Hegel, in that quotation, just pulls a rabbit out of a hat. He introduced a new concept called becoming, and at the same time he trashes the conventions of formal logic, because he says that being and nothing are both the same, and they are not the same. And just to add to this dizzying effect, he introduces the idea of dynamic change, where the concepts supposedly move and vanish into their opposites. And of course, many philosophers at this point accuse Hegel of failing to grasp the basic rules of formal logic. So let's add the distinction between pure nothing and pure being to our picture. I'm just going to use the plus and minus symbols to indicate that pure being connotes existence, affirmation, and pure nothing connotes non-existence or negation. And obviously we have to use a ready-made language to describe anything, and Hegel uses German and Latin, but he warns us that languages come with presuppositions and semantic baggage which might not apply to the phenomena and therefore might mislead. So we've got to be a bit careful when we're describing this beginning. And obviously Hegel's logic has been translated into many languages, so we don't have to use German and Latin. And in fact, I'm going to translate Hegel's statements into a simple mathematical model, which I think makes the structure of his argument clearer. So, Hegel talks of change, of vanishing and movement. And change implies a sequence of states that the thing undergoes. And we need a way to denote those states in that sequence. I'm going to use the symbol T for that purpose. And obviously that choice suggests time, but try to think of it merely as a way of referring to states in an ordered sequence. So, if pure being vanishes into its opposite, then it must change in some way. So we can write this as dx by dt equals something. And this dx by dt just simply denotes how being changes from one state to the next. So how does it change? Well, we know it must change in a way that reflects its difference from pure nothing, and pure being affirms existence. So we'll say, as we said here, that it changes in a positive direction. We don't know how it's changing yet. So what does pure being change with respect to? What's the cause of its change? And the answer here is quite clear from Hegel's text, at least. We have thought contemplating itself. In other words, being changes positively with respect to itself, which I've called X. You can see that. Oh dear. So we can perform the same exercise, but for pure nothing. Again, it must change to reflect its negativity. And of course, what can it change with respect to? Well, there's nothing at all, there's just nothing. So it must be, it changes with respect to itself, but in a negative way. So we can write that. So now we have two simple mathematical statements that describe two different ways in which thought can contemplate itself. Now, Hegel says that being and nothing are different and yet somehow vanishing into each other and therefore are the same. And so let's examine this by solving these equations and seeing in fact how they change according to this interpretation. So I'm going to skip the math, but when we solve this equation we basically get x as a function of t equals, well, let's just call it k, some constant which we're going to ignore, e to the t. And that is in fact exponential growth. And so we can plot being, the sequence of states of being. And if we start from a small value, it will grow and grow and grow. And it will, as the sequence increases, it will explode towards infinity. It never gets to infinity, but it gets closer and closer to infinity. So it's definitely not vanishing, it's getting bigger and bigger. But Hegel doesn't really say that being vanishes, he says it vanishes into its opposite. But that doesn't seem to be happening either at the moment. So let's now solve the equation for pure nothing. And we get this solution. Again, a constant. We get 1 over e to the t. And what we find is, if we start from somewhere big, it will decrease and get closer and closer to 0. So pure being is vanishing, it's getting smaller and smaller. This exhibits what Hegel calls a coming to be. This exhibits a ceasing to be. So we've got being and nothing now moving in their distinct ways, but we haven't seen them vanishing into each other just yet. So at this point, I just want to emphasize that Hegel's vanishing has two aspects. It has like a logical aspect, in a sense, and a causal aspect. So from a logical point of view, the vanishing of being into its opposite, nothing, and vice versa, is similar to the famous liar paradox. So the paradox arises when we consider the truth of the following statement. This sentence is false. Obviously, if the sentence is true, then it must be false. But if it's false, then the sentence must be true. And so we go around and around, repeatedly flipping back and forth between the statement being true or false. And in a very similar way, Hegel's concepts of pure being implies pure nothing, but pure nothing implies pure being, and so on repeatedly. And both viewpoints are equally applicable to the beginning. So Hegel's vanishing into the opposite has this logical aspect of implication between the concepts. But the vanishing isn't only logical, because being and nothing themselves move into their opposites. He talks about them as actual processes which have their own intrinsic dynamic. So Hegel's vanishing into this opposite also has this causal aspect as well. And if we look a little closer, we can identify both the logical and causal aspects of Hegel's vanishing in the equations I've written on the whiteboard. So the first thing to notice is if we look at the trajectories of pure being and pure nothing, they are mirror images of each other, where there's the mirror line. And in fact, we can define a function that maps between these trajectories, and in the consequence, they're mathematically isomorphic to each other. So we can repeatedly flip back and forth by applying an isomorphic map. And so pure being and pure nothing are opposites, but the coming to be of pure being is, in a sense, from a higher viewpoint, identical to the ceasing to be of pure nothing. And in this logical sense, they vanish into their opposites. So although they're different, they are in a different sense identical. Let's now consider this causal aspect of the vanishing. So being explodes towards infinity. And if you think about any natural or mechanical system with that internal dynamic, eventually it would fall apart, it would literally shake apart. It could only exist for a short time. And similarly, pure nothing implodes towards zero. And again, any real system with this property would quickly cease and become inert. So being and nothing as purely self-referential systems are unstable. They can't permanently exist in their pure states of self-reflection. Now, although that's suggestive, it isn't vanishing into their opposites, but we can make sense of this too. If we consider being in a state really close to zero, as close as we'd like it to be, then we have being in a state that's very close to the asymptote of pure nothing, which is zero. So if we're beginning in this state of close to pure nothing, we rapidly vanish towards the asymptote of pure being at infinity. So in other words, when we try to contemplate pure nothing, there's always this irreducible element of existence, which, when we notice it, takes over and flowers into pure being. And we can look at this the other way. We consider nothing in a state as close as we want to infinity, which is close to the asymptote of pure being. And in this state, nothing will rapidly vanish towards the asymptote of pure nothing, which is zero. So in other words, when we contemplate the state of pure being, there's this irreducible element of non-existence, or nothing that arises, that when we notice, takes over and decays into pure nothing. So in this causal sense, being and nothing do indeed vanish into their opposites. So I think we can make sense of Hegel's talk of identity and difference and vanishing into opposites. It can make perfect sense if we interpret Hegel as essentially talking about isomorphic positive and negative feedback loops. So at the beginning of logic, we shed all our assumptions, including our own ego, and simply contemplate thought itself. At that point, we enter a self-referential feedback loop. The mental state has paradoxical properties. We seem to be contemplating being, but this is identical to something different, which is nothing, and both points of view make sense. Yet, both points of view are unstable, and the pure states they strive towards can never be reached. So Hegel's beginning appears to be logically inconsistent and also causally unstable. The beginning doesn't make sense, and it can't exist. And as Hegel acknowledges, the beginning is indeed incomprehensible. So should we throw up our hands at this point? Is it a dead end? Well, this is actually where Hegel begins to get very interesting. So up to now we've been thinking of being and nothing as separate things. We have two separate models of thought contemplating itself. And so far we've noticed how they relate to each other. But Hegel says that we need to get out of the way and notice how being and nothing themselves relate to each other. They don't need our help to do it. The beginning is a paradox only because we've been thinking about parts, not wholes. We thought we were observing two independent things, but really they're just aspects of one thing. And Hegel says being and nothing constitute an irreducible whole, which he calls becoming. So here's another Hegel quote for fun. He says, becoming is the unseparatedness of being and nothing, not the unity that abstracts from being and nothing. As the unity of being and nothing, it is rather this determinate unity, or one in which being and nothing equally are. However, insomuch as being and nothing are each unseparated from its other, each is not. In this unity, therefore, they are but as vanishing only as sublated. They sink from their initially represented self-subsistence into moments which are still distinguished, but at the same time sublated. So, that's another good paragraph from Hegel. Hegel asks us to notice a new phenomenon, which he calls sublation. And in this sublation, being and nothing are joined in a unity, where they still vanish into their opposites, but in a new way. So this sublation is meant to get rid of their initially represented self-subsistence. So rather than pure being and pure nothing relating only to themselves, they now relate to each other. And we can model Hegel's idea of sublation by literally joining the feedback systems together. So the output of being becomes the input of nothing, and the output of nothing becomes the input of being. And therefore this equation becomes y, and this equation becomes x minus x. And this is no longer true. So in this unity, being no longer affirms its own existence, it now affirms non-existence, and being now changes positive with respect to nothing. And on the other side, nothing no longer negates its own existence, but now negates being, and therefore changes negatively with respect to being. And so we've got a new system of coupled differential equations, and I'll refer to these equations as Hegel's contradiction. So he states that becoming contains being and nothing as reciprocally referring to each other, which we have now, but these relations are of an equal value, and in this interpretation we can immediately see that in general dx by dt will not be equal to dy by dt. And Hegel also says that being passes over into nothing and nothing passes over into being, and in this coupled system we have a substance that actually flows from being into nothing, and the substance leaves nothing and enters into being. And this sublation does preserve the positive and negative aspects of being and nothing. They're still different from each other. But Hegel says that being and nothing have different directions, and are so different they interpenetrate and paralyze each other. So in what sense do they paralyze each other? And here Hegel introduces the idea of order and chaos in another paragraph that's a bit mysterious, so some more fun from Hegel. He says the equilibrium in which coming to be and ceasing to be are poised is in the first place becoming itself. But this becoming equally collects itself in quiescent unity. Being and nothing are in it only as vanishing. Becoming itself, however, is only by virtue of their being distinguished. Their vanishing is therefore the vanishing of becoming, or the vanishing of the vanishing itself. Becoming is a ceaseless unrest that collapses into a quiescent result. So here we've got another typically Hegelian claim. Becoming is both a ceaseless unrest and a quiescent result. So the vanishing that previously implied that being and nothing would cease to exist, now in the sublated state, vanishes the vanishing itself, such that we now have ceaseless unrest that paradoxically collapses to a stable result that presumably don't vanish by exploding or imploding. So is it possible to make any sense of this? Well, we can by solving Hegel's contradiction. So I'm going to skip all the stages and just give you the solution to the coupled system. And what we get is glossing over some issues which aren't significant to the derivation. We have x changes according to the cosine of t, and y changes to the negative of the sine of t. Okay, so we can plot this behavior and take a look. So let's get rid of this. And this is the magnitude of x and y, and this is t. And let's have x doing this. And let's have y doing this. If I can draw it properly, I'll try this. Okay. Yeah, we get that. Sine and cosine. So what we see is that being and nothing now oscillate between finite limits forever. They oscillate in the same way, but they're permanently out of phase. When being achieves its maximum, nothing is at a minimum of zero, and vice versa. And in fact, we can show that those equations satisfy a simple conservation law. So becoming is a process where coming to be affirms ceasing to be, and ceasing to be negates coming to be forever. And this continual dance of cooperation or conflict never settles down. So this unity of being and nothing is unstable because the states never settle into steady values. The opposing concepts pull in different directions, and any equilibrium is immediately undermined. So Hegel's contradiction does indeed generate ceaseless unrest, but typically for Hegel it's also meant to be a quiescent result, so can we make sense of this too? So at every moment, becoming has these two internal states, x and y, which come in pairs. Any point t in the sequence is a value of x paired with a value of t. And we can plot that in this way. We have x and we have y. And we're going to look at all the possible pairs of values this system can take. What we find is that the state space of the dynamic system is a perfect circle. And the circle is a direct result of the fact that Hegel's contradiction satisfies this conservation law. So although becoming is a ceaseless unrest, that unrest is always bounded with indefinite limits. And pure being, which previously we thought only self-related, explodes, and pure nothing imploded. In a sense they couldn't exist, but now in this sublated unity we have a stable dynamic system that neither explodes or implodes, but it's a quiescent, stable result that reproduces itself indefinitely forever. So let's summarize what I think Hegel is saying before coming to a close. So our most abstract possible concepts seem paradoxical. Being and nothing are the same, yet they're different. They imply each other, but they also contradict each other, but they necessarily imply each other. And becoming is the name that Hegel gives to this unity. And this sublation of being and nothing preserves their vanishing, but instead of completely vanishing, the vanishing is vanished. And they now interpenetrate each other and mutually vanishing to each other by exchanging their substance in this oscillatory but conservative manner. So becoming is therefore ceaseless unrest that nonetheless remains stable over time. So the beginning is a dynamic and contradictory unity. And this beginning, according to Hegel, reveals properties that must be shared by everything. So this fundamental structure becoming must be present in anything that exists at all. And so what's very interesting about Hegel's metaphysical argument is that it implies that negativity or nothing or non-existence is not the absence of being, but it's an irreducible kind of being. So he's a substance monist, but his substance has two fundamentally different aspects. So this is a very strong claim that Hegel makes about the necessary structure of everything that exists. So is there any evidence for it? Or is Hegel's logic just merely nice metaphysical poetry? So I skipped all the steps when solving Hegel's equations. There's an intermediate step in the solution, which is just a different representation of exactly the same system, and it's this. So in this sublated state, looking at it in a different way, being and nothing still in fact relate to themselves. That is preserved in the sublation, but they relate in a different way. And those with a physics background will immediately recognize that those equations describe simple harmonic motion. And it's no coincidence that we see wave-like phenomena in their behavior. And you've all heard of simple harmonic oscillators because they are the bread and butter of physics courses, and that's because they are ubiquitous in nature. They really are everywhere, both in the microcosm, in terms of quantum mechanics, where they appear, and also in the macrocosm, where they appear in general relativity. And for example, quantum field theory, which is the current dominant theory of fundamental particles, essentially that theory is simple harmonic motion taken to increasing levels of abstraction. So it's completely uncontroversial to state that simple harmonic motion is a fundamental structure that appears again and again at all levels of reality. Now, obviously, physicists have observed harmonic oscillation, and they developed a formal theory to describe it. They don't need any help from Hegel to do this. But physicists tend not to ask, and perhaps they couldn't answer, why is wave motion everywhere in nature? And Hegel's metaphysics, in contrast, can give a candidate explanation for this empirical phenomenon. According to Hegel, everything that exists necessarily is a unity of being and nothing, and therefore, according to this interpretation, it must exhibit simple harmonic motion. So I think it's very remarkable that Hegel's mystical starting point, which is purely conceptual and abstract and makes no reference to physical reality or empirical knowledge whatsoever, nonetheless implies a structure of becoming that is equivalent to the fundamental structure found everywhere in physical science. So let me wrap up. As a teaser for next time, I want to examine whether Hegel's logic can tell us something new about a domain that seems particularly static and impervious to change, which is the realm of natural numbers. Surprisingly, Hegel's contradiction does appear in the study of prime numbers, although number theorists tend not to think of their work in that way. But for now, that's it, so I look forward to a discussion.